acknowledge. Of course, I acknowledge this is an extraordinarily difficult issue, and I've been entirely open about the fact that we have not been able to deliver. We have not been able to deliver the policy that we held in opposition.
Like my brother who's just started out university is going to pay ridiculous amounts when he leaves university, and it's ridiculous. 30 years ago, my parents at university, they went absolutely jack all to go and get an education. Now we've got to pay how much we're going to be earning. It's ridiculous.
I mean, this isn't really going to affect you directly.
That's irrelevant. Yeah, it's completely irrelevant whether it affects me or whether it affects Jim. It's going to affect people going to university next year and the year after, and they're just as important as we are. You're the kind like me could hypnotize. Just think of all those guys who would tell you lies. I wanna spend it
I think a lot of the problem with the new budget cuts when it comes to the education system is that actually we're looking at a massive funding gap within education from previous years. The government has decided they've got to make cuts, and education and healthcare and other sectors like that are going to get cut. And we're now really seeing it come to par where we see a number of universities across the country cutting courses, cutting the number of staff there, and thus restricting education within the UK. I mean, when we talk about raising tuition fees, which is the plan of the Brown Review now, as we were promised tuition fees were going to only go up in certain universities, and even then only by a small amount. Now we're seeing it's going to be a wide-scale change. Most universities are going to be charging £9,000 for their top courses. And suddenly now we're looking at a new generation of students who are going to come out of university with a massive amount of debt, like nothing we've ever seen before. And it's a staggering amount, a completely unrealistic amount. And effectively what we're seeing is happening is education is going back to if you can go if you can afford it. Well, we heard the plans from the education secretary the other day talking about how actually students from the richer backgrounds, from families who can afford it, could buy their places at university. And this has been passed off, by this government as a blasé thing, as an idea to loosen up more places for lower income students. But what we're effectively saying, you can now buy a degree. And that was something they said would never happen. Education was going to be based on merit, never on your ability to pay. And actually we're seeing a return to that system. These slots, which could have gone and should have gone to people who've got the talent, who've got the ability to do that, like it's gone to people who have just bought those slots. So actually, when you talk about giving these slots away, they're not being given away. They're being bought by these people, and that's restricting somebody else, a member of society, who otherwise could have gone from doing that. And that's not and that's not right. Education should be open. Education should be for everybody. I think it's an inevitable fact that in some areas of university teaching, just like in many other areas of education within Britain, that there will, if you make cuts, services are going to suffer. There's no two ways about that. Yeah, at the university I go to, there's been a number of cuts. They've cut courses. The support staff within the university, they've seen wage freezes. They've seen redundancies, and within my own course itself, there's been elements of that course that have been closed down due to forced redundancies and voluntary redundancies within that department. Because those courses are no longer profitable enough for the university. Don't attract enough students who they see as customers. I think that's a difficult question, because actually when you talk about the pride of academia within Britain, a lot of that's led not just through teaching but through the research they do. And these cuts, which will affect research in some areas, the other areas of research within the university is largely supported by charities, largely supported by private interests, and I think that will continue. I think when you talk about the excellence of the British education system, the prestige, I think that prestige is that it was an education system for everybody, just like a health system is a health system for everybody. That regardless of your background or your class or your financial situation, you could go and have an education if you had the ability to go do that. And I think that's what we're really losing here with these cuts. And that's when you hear these politicians come up on the TV and they talk about figures and they talk about cuts and they talk about the need to do this. I think there's one absolute true fact we have to keep going with this, is actually these cuts are completely falsely imposed upon us. It was caused by a banking crisis which was caused by the private sector, by private interests, and it has been bailed out with public money, and rather than return that public money to the public bank, they've decided to cut those public services that are a very right of our society. They are, and rather than accrue that money back from the private sector, they've let it be swallowed up by the private sector, and instead they're making ordinary people like you and me, people who work in hospitals, people who try to get an education, people who are trying to pay their rent, they're making us pay for it. When you talk about riots, what you're actually talking about is demonstrations within London. And we've had demonstrations not just from students but from disabled people, from teachers, from people who've lost their jobs within the wider society, huge segments of society coming out to speak against these cuts. And I think the problem when you talk about riots is a term that's bandied about by in the media. I think, unfortunately, an element of violence, an element of disruption is sometimes inevitable, just as a protest is meant to disrupt, but not in a violent way. And I think we've got to look at where the violence really comes from is the state, actually, in the way the police control these protests, the way they patrol them. And I think the way they force innocent people into circumstances that are inhumane. And what they're trying to do is have a peaceful protest. These protests never start off violent, do they? You don't have loads of students running up and down the street smashing stuff up from straight away.
It doesn't matter if you're in a uniform, assault is assault!
Actually, how do they start? They start with marches, they start with peaceful protest, and it's only when the police get involved and use tactics such as kettling, such as baton charges, such as charges against otherwise peaceful protesters, then you see people become violent. Because that actually what you see through that very act of the police doing, you're seeing a breakdown of society. A breakdown of law and order enforced by society because society can't handle what these people are asking for.